Paweł Grabarczyk. Paweł works at the Center for Games Research, Computer Games Research in Copenhagen, and he tries to find some philosophical or ethically interesting questions in current development in computer games. And today we will talk about two sides of randomness.
Thanks, Marty. And let me start by thanking you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and happy to present our stuff. So, yeah, the first thing is I'd like to just quickly point out what exactly I'm doing in the center and what it is. So, as mentioned down, I work in ITU. This is this building. It's actually one building only, so it's a super small university. It's a nice building, but only one building. So that's the trade. This is how it looks inside. So it's like very modern and very technically oriented. And the main idea behind this university, and the main difference between other universities in Denmark and in other places, is that it actually tries to encapsulate everything that is related to IT. So it teaches programming, it teaches robotics, but at the same time it also teaches business related to IT, and also it has a group of humanists who work on the analysis, the sociological analysis of IT, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that everything related to IT under one roof. And I believe it works very nicely. So what I do there and what we do there in the games group, let me just quickly point it out. This is, I'm a part of a project that is called Making Sense of Games. It is an ERC project that is realized currently at the ITU. And this is a project led by Espen Aarseth, who is a leading figure in game studies. You could even say that basically it's a person who started the discipline. So what we do there is that the aim of this particular project is to create a comprehensive set of theories for game analysis. So we want to create maybe not one huge theory of everything related to games, but rather a set of theories suitable for different things. So one example of this is that the result of this should be a host of conceptual tools for academic usage, but as well as for educational usage. So the dream of this project is that at the end of this project we will be able, for example, to introduce game studies to schools as a part of the curriculum. So the idea is that when you are at school, whether it's elementary school or high school, people in school analyze books, they analyze movies, they analyze theater plays. They learn about it, but they typically do not analyze games, as if games were not part of culture, or as if they were not art form. So our idea is that why not? They should also have games as something that they could analyze and talk about. But in order to do that, we need some kind of tools, conceptual tools to talk about games, because the main idea behind this project, and more or less the whole project of game studies, is that it's not possible to take the existing tools, the existing conceptual tools and theories for the analysis of movies or for the analysis of literature and just apply it to games, because games are a different medium with some specifics of their own. And because of that, we have to create some new tools. That's the main idea. So, and the project consists of psychologists, literature researchers, games researchers, and a philosopher that is me. I'm a philosopher, unfortunately, but it also has some perks. So, today I'm going to talk about randomness in games. And the main idea behind this lecture is that I want to show you an example of a research on games, on a very specific subject, randomness in games. And I will present two sides of randomness, as the title suggests. I will call it the dark side of it and the light side of it. But it's not only that. It's also, both of these sides represent two different things that we can get from smashing philosophy with game studies. So the first part, the dark side, as I call it, will be a presentation of how can philosophy be applied to a very specific domain, and how an application of philosophy can be useful for society. And the other side, the light side, will be an example of how the study of games can actually inspire some interest in philosophical questions. So it's kind of like a service for both. In the first part, I will talk how philosophy is useful for game studies. In the other part, I will be talking how game studies sometimes is useful for philosophy. I will inspire some interesting questions. So, in order to start, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what randomness is, or rather how I will understand randomness in this talk. So, there are two different definitions which more or less come to the same thing. So first of all, we might say that randomness is a lack of predictable patterns. This is an example of a random pattern that I generated from one of the tools that are available on the internet. And the other definition is, which comes from Paweł, is a random string is a string that is shorter than any procedure which can generate it. So this is more or less the definitions that I'm going to operate on. The first one is more important for us. This is just lack of predictability of patterns. So the first question is, can randomness appear in computer games at all? Some people might say, nah, I mean, there is no randomness in computer games at all, because these are just machines which use algorithms, so how can there be anything random, right? So obviously, we just have to sort this question. So, first of all, it's very useful to remember that randomness in games evolved from simple random generators used in board games. We don't normally think about dice as random generators, but this is what they are, right? So they introduce some interest in, they give variety to our games. But what about computer games? What happens in computer games? So, in the case of computer games, we should differentiate between something that is called true and pseudo-randomness. So pseudo-randomness is basically a situation where a computer generates a random number using a data that it has in itself, and it's good enough for most purposes, but it's not useful for some other purposes. So how it works in practice is that if you want to generate a random number in a computer, the computer, for example, takes the number of seconds it runs, so the number of seconds that passed since it was turned on, and then, for example, a date. It can take, for example, its temperature, data like that, and then combine it and give you the number. This is what we call pseudo-randomness. It's called pseudo-randomness because, from a philosophical standpoint, if the same circumstances happened again, the number would have been the same. So, so it's not real randomness, which should be like totally unpredictable. So the other way of using randomness in computer games is to actually tap into true randomness, and the way computers do it is that they simply take the numbers or the values from outside. So what we do in computers is that's why the picture of the lava lamp is here, because lava lamps were actually really used to generate true randomness, because lava lamp, you know what it is, it's just like a lamp which there is a fluid which changes and it looks nice. But the point is that we cannot predict the physics of this fluid nicely. So if you put a camera, you use a camera and just record this lamp, you can get random numbers from it, and they will be true random numbers. So if you go, for example, to a website called random.org, you can get random numbers which are true random numbers, taken from outside of computers. So it's actually right now it's very easy to obtain true randomness in computers, provided you have internet connection. So randomness can be present, even true randomness can be present in video games if you choose to use it. And one thing that I want to differentiate is that, of course, randomness can be used to produce a game, but I'll be talking about randomness which is used when the game is running. So while the game executes itself, it uses random procedures. Because as in this example, it's an example of a game called Just Cause 2. In this game, for example, they use random procedures to generate the map, but later the game more or less doesn't use that much randomness. So what I'll be talking about games which run, and then they use random procedures for something. Unlike just for So, of course, so once we know that randomness can appear in games, let's ask another question. Should randomness appear in games? So, is it a good idea? So, first of all, for some genres of games, chance is the epitome of bad design. They have to be meticulously crafted machines to skillfully operate. So there are games in which if something random happens, people would say this is a horrible game. It can't be random. So a good example of this would be, I don't know how much the game you know, but I'll just throw it away anyway. A good example would be a classic platformer like Mega Man series, where people who play this game just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and learn patterns. And they are good at it because they learn patterns. So if the game throws anything random at them, that would be a horrible game that easily. So there can't be anything random in these games. But on the other hand, for some games, the element of true randomness is necessary. Imagine a casino game where there is no randomness. In the case of any gambling games, the whole point is that there is true randomness in them. So if you use an online casino, the online casino better has connection to a true random number generator, because otherwise it's like a bit of a fake casino. So for some games it's like completely impossible, for some games it's crucial. But most games are somewhere in between. In most games it's just, in some aspects it could be random and it's better, and some aspects should not be random. So most games fall in this in-between category, especially computer games. So, why exactly people use random procedures in video games? What's the point? So the first thing is that it gives us replayability. In other words, it just allows you to play the game 1,000 times, and it always is a little bit fresh here, because something new happens. And the picture here is from a game called The Binding of Isaac. And this is actually a picture, a thumbnail from YouTube from a series where one of the players just plays the game and records his play. And it's the episode 807. And every episode takes 40 minutes. But the game could actually be finished in probably like 15 minutes. So the point is that you can have that many hours of this game because it contains a lot of randomness. And all of these episodes are entertaining for the viewers also, because the viewers might see something that will never happen to them when they play the game. And second of all, of course, randomness gives us pleasure. Randomness is a very important thing for our brains. We like randomness. We like surprises. And the reason we like surprises is actually well understood. The mechanism is well understood in psychology. And what happens to our brains when we encounter a random thing is that, well, our brains are basically just designed to look for patterns in reality, right? So we want to find patterns. So the moment something nice happens and your brain does not see any mechanism behind this nice thing that happened. So something nice happened, but my brain doesn't know why. The brain wants to know why this happened and wants to find the pattern behind it. But in order to find the pattern behind anything, you have to have more samples for statistical analysis. So you have to do it again and again and again, so the brain can find the pattern. In other words, the brain wants to have a statistically relevant sample. So the brain needs to trick you to do that again. So whenever it happens, the brain just gives you a dopamine shot. And it's not that you feel that, it would be cool to do the same thing again. So you have this nice feeling of repeating this procedure, and you start to like this procedure because it gave you something nice, because the brain wants to find a pattern behind it, and it will never find a pattern because there is no pattern. So it becomes just a fun thing in itself for you. So let's go to the problem of two sides of randomness, which I advertised at the beginning. So as I said, the usage of randomness has two sides. One side is very problematic, and the other side is actually very inspiring and interesting. So this first side will be the application of philosophy to games. So the dark side is connected with something we called, or rather not we called, which is popularly called loot boxes. How many of you know what loot boxes are? Okay, not many, but some. So I will explain this. So the idea behind loot boxes is that they are basically random reward mechanisms in games. And the way they work is that you have some kind of condition in a game. For example, slaying a monster in a game. You slay a monster in a game. And then in a typical game, which does not use loot boxes or anything like that, in a typical game, you slay the monster, you get the reward. For example, a better gun. That's fine. But in this situation, there is an intermediate aspect. So you slay the monster, but then there is a random procedure. And you get something based on this random procedure. So you slay the monster, and then a mysterious box appears. And it starts to shake a little bit, and it opens. And inside there is a gun. But you know, because this is how it's presented to you, you know that, well, if I was more lucky, I could have gotten a better gun. Because the moment when the reward was being given to me was a random procedure. So they are like a random intermediaries between something you do and between the reward. And this is actually interesting because at some point, this random reward started to be very popular in games. So around, let's say, 2015, 2016, there was an explosion of games containing these mechanics. This random moment where something was designed for it. So loot boxes are, that's the definition, intermediary random or semi-random mechanisms which deliver rewards to the player. So you get a reward after some kind of lottery. So, some of the most popular games which contain loot boxes are Overwatch, Hearthstone, that you might have played, and FIFA, which contains random packs of cards, which gives you different players to your team. Historically, if someone is interested in when this phenomenon started, is that in the West, it started around 2010, when a game, Team Fortress, got an update in which it got something called main economy, which was basically economy added to it, based on randomness. But also UEFA Champions League was the first game which introduced it. So it was even earlier than Team Fortress. But the oldest game we could find that contained it is a Chinese game called City Online. So this is the oldest example we have. So you can see the oldest example we have comes from 2006. So it's quite a new phenomenon. This game, unfortunately, you cannot ever play it because it was an online game. The servers are turned off. It's another problem for game studies, that many games just disappear, or if they are online games, you cannot study them again because they are turned off. So we can only see YouTube videos of it. You might say, okay, but randomness and things like that were actually in many other games earlier. I give an example with Diablo, where you get different chests, open chests, you get something out of the chest, and it's random. So why am I saying that it's a new phenomenon? I mean, even in games as old as Rogue from 1980, there was a lot of randomness in this game. So why am I saying that this is something new? And also you might say that, well, it's also rather similar to non-game phenomena. I mean, if you think of collectible cards, such as Pokemon cards, or collectible card games, such as Pokemon or Magic the Gathering, it's the same. You go and buy a pack of cards, you don't know what's inside, you open it and you are either very happy or unhappy. Or, even if you go further, things like collectible cards for football player cards, or Kinder surprises. I mean, these are also random generators that you get in shops, and you are either happy or not unhappy. kind of like chests you open. But this thing in the middle, which looks kind of like washing machines or something, is actually, does anyone know what it is? It's a Japanese thing. It's a Japanese machine called gacha. And the machine is not called gacha. The thing that is inside is gacha. It's called gacha. It's a gacha machine. So these are basically machines that are super popular in Japan. That you go and you pay 100 or 200 yens, and then you get a small ball, and inside the ball is a small figurine. And some of these figurines are considered very rare, and some are not very rare. So it's basically very similar to Kingdom Surprises. And they are hugely popular. And many people say that what happened to video games is that this Japanese mechanism has been transported to video games, virtualized, so to speak. So we might say, I mean, again, there are so many similar phenomena. Why am I singling out these loot boxes? What's the reason for it? And so the reason, I forgot about this. This is a bit obscure. So in Japan, you also have something called mystery shopping. You go to a shop, and you pay something for a sealed bag, and you don't know what is inside. And you might get something that is much more expensive than what you paid, or you may get something that is more or less for what you paid. And even Apple uses this scheme in Japan. Although it's not, outside of Japan, it's not that popular. So why am I singling out these loot boxes if there are similar phenomena? So first of all, loot boxes celebrate randomness. So if you play one of these older games, you might even not know that there are random elements in it. You might actually, you would have to think, oh, I replayed it and there is something different. No, it's probably random. You would have to guess by yourself. But in these new games with loot boxes, it's very, very celebrated. So it's kind of like a small casino moment, where, as I said, the box starts to shake and there's a fanfare, and you are shown after a second what was inside, even though the real procedure was actually earlier. So they celebrate randomness. And also loot boxes, and that's a big deal, loot boxes prey on similar cognitive fallacies as gambling. And that's the big reason why people started to work. They prey on the same fallacies. What fallacies are there? Well, first of all, of course, gambler's fallacy. So they give you this nice feeling, oh, I was unlucky with these 5 loot boxes in a row. But this time I have to get something good. Near misses. So they often present you like a series of boxes and they show you, this is an item I was going to get, but it was so close, but I got these worse items. So you feel that, next time I'm lucky. And they use losers disguised as wins. So they use it's a very classic system for gambling. So when you open a loot box, you always get something. So they tell you, you never lose technically. In reality, you lose because you got things you don't want. But it looks as if you always win. It's just that there are some uninteresting items that you got, and they can always tell you always win. And of course, you have a sunk cost bias, because that's the most important thing, and it's a new thing in these games. In many of these games, you can buy these loot boxes for real money. So what we call eligibility condition is not only slaying the monster. If you're tired of slaying the monsters, you can just pay and get a new loot box, and pay again and get a new loot box. And then it looks like very much like a normal lottery. And it gives you something called sunk cost bias, which functions the following way. When you put a lot of money into something, and you feel that you almost lost a lot of money on it, and you have this argumentation in your head that I put so much money on it that I better invest more, because backing out now, stopping playing now would be a bad idea. So they prey on these very similar cognitive biases, because as we know, all of them are biases. So that's a problem, and that's created a huge controversy. Some of the papers pointed out that some people, for example, spend $10,000 on these loot boxes. I've read an interview with a player who was spending around $2,000 a month on it for several years. So sometimes it's a huge investment or loss, and some people, again, 70,000, things like that. So news stories like that started to appear, and people started to get noticed, and people started to question whether these things are gambling or not. And the result of this was that, for example, the Netherlands declares that some loot boxes are illegal, and video game loot boxes are now considered criminal gambling in Belgium. So in Belgium, loot boxes are banned. So, and in many countries, especially in European Union, but as well also in Australia, I pointed out at the end, started to discuss whether we should ban this procedure or ban this mechanism or not, because basically they started to say, well, this is just gambling, and that has been relabeled as something else. So, and it's a huge problem for game studies as well, and game scholars, because games were, for a long time, video games especially, were accused of being addictive and so on. So if we really have now, if it's true, that we have gambling inside, well, then this will be finally true. Because many people in game studies believe that games are not addictive in any way. They are just as addictive as anything, reading a book. But if they contain gambling elements, then it's a different story. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to help, because we realized that at this point the public discussion around this phenomenon of loot boxes is in a very weird spot, where some countries start to ban them, some countries start to discuss about banning maybe, I don't know, only some of them, and so on and so forth. So we decided that, yeah, it would be good to create a classification of types of loot boxes, because our point was that not all games which contain randomness or loot or something that looks like a loot box fall into the same category. And maybe it's a bad idea to just ban them all. Maybe just before you try to ban them or create some kind of legislation, maybe it would be better to see, okay, there are different types, so maybe we should just ban one of them and not ban the others. So we decided to create a typology, and this is the type of study that we wanted to do. It's basically an application of kind of like an ontology for loot boxes. So we wanted to create a typology of loot boxes and tell people there are at least 4 types of them. So whenever you talk about banning them or legislation, ask which games fall into which category. Because, for example, Belgium, from our point of view, was a little bit too hasty. So first of all, there's an example of a situation where you have RRM is basically a loot box. So RRM is basically this random reward mechanism. You have games in which there is some kind of random mechanism and there's a reward, and that's it. There are games like that. And Diablo is an example of this. But sometimes what you can do is that you can basically add money on one side. So if you have a game which has a random reward mechanism, then you get the reward. But then it is possible for you to sell the reward for real money. That should constitute a different category. So as you're going to see, these 4 types of loot boxes or 4 types of random reward mechanisms depends on where the real money goes. So if money goes on this side, this is actually it's not an empty category, but it's a very rare category. One example of a game like that is Diablo 3, which at the beginning had something called auction house, where you could sell objects. It does not now contain it. But it's possible to create a game like that. There are also games which contain money on the other side. And Overwatch is an example of this. So there are games in which you can put your real money to initiate the random procedure and get the reward. But you can't sell the reward. The reward stays is completely shielded from real life economy. And then the 4th option is that you have games in which you can do both. You can put your money to initiate the random procedure, get your reward, and then sell your reward for real money. And PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, or PUBG as it is often called, is an example of this. Team Fortress is another example of this. Counter-Strike Go is another example of this, where you can do this. So, to put them on one slide, we have 4 types of loot boxes, depending on where the money goes. If there's no money involved, money on the selling side, money on the buying side, or money on both sides. And our argument is that only the 4th category is actually functionally identical to gambling. So the 4th category is basically gambling, renamed. So, but the 3rd category is something that we should more or less study more, because this is actually a new phenomenon. A phenomenon where you could play a lottery, but you will never get anything valuable out of this lottery. The only value this has is value for you because you like the item, or you can basically use it in a game or whatever, but you can never sell it. And these 2 first categories are actually quite safe because they are completely not comparable to, they are not dissimilar to gambling. So if a given game belongs to these 2 categories, it shouldn't be touched by legislation. If it falls into this category, it should probably be treated just as gambling is treated in a given country. And when it comes to this category, well, here is where basically more empirical studies is needed for us to understand this phenomenon, because we actually didn't have this kind of phenomenon earlier. So this was our typology, and what was nice is that originally we had a very nice meeting with people who are basically responsible for legislation of gambling in Denmark. Hopefully they used some of our knowledge, of our typology. But one of the successes that we had is that the Australian government simply used our classification for their legislation system. So it was exactly what we wanted. We created something that was used by the public. So again, this is more or less like for me, a good example of how can you apply philosophy to something that's practical, because you're just making an ontology-based typology, and it is then used by society. So, what's the light side of randomness? Because that was the downside. And the light side of randomness is just, basically, as I said, something that is in games, and I think might be inspirational for philosophy. So this is a screenshot for an old game called Frontier. So basically what is interesting is something we call procedural generation, and it's a little bit different than randomness, but it is connected to randomness in a meaningful way. So first of all, the difference is that you can do things, in computers you can do things manually. For example, you can paint a picture using a computer program and then use it as graphics for your game, or you can paint, without painting a single pixel, just create a procedure, a mathematical procedure that will generate the picture for you. So when we say procedural, what we mean is that it's an algorithm, a procedure that creates something, instead of an author who creates something. So procedural music would be, again, as you probably know, procedural music would be a music that is generated by a procedure instead of a composer. Composer is a programmer in this case. And procedural generation does not have to have random elements, but it typically does. It's typically combined with something we call random seed, and without going into details, we have to go into them during the discussion. This random element is used for the procedural generation. Sometimes the seed is presented to a player. And so games which function this way can be likened to possible worlds. So let me just quickly explain what I mean. When you play a 3D game which has a fixed world, like Grand Theft Auto or Skyrim or whatever, you explore this world. But when you play, you explore this world and other players explore the same world you do. So we can talk about it later. But if you play a game like Minecraft, you are not exploring the same world that your friends are exploring. Everybody who runs Minecraft has their own world. And these worlds are of course similar to each other in many ways. They are like variations on a set of laws that generated Minecraft. world. So they are very much like possible worlds. You have you have a number of general rules, and then you have infinite numbers of worlds that are different from each other in certain things. So, interestingly, procedural generation is actually almost universally praised. Many people say that it's one of the greatest things that happened to gaming. And similar to loot boxes, it was there earlier, but right now, I would say that we are living in the age of procedural generation. Like a huge number of games, especially the most successful games, contain procedural generation. So, it starts to be used in multiple genres. That's a screenshot of many games, popular games which contain procedural generation. Many of these games are very successful, commercially and critically. And all of them contain procedurally generated words or levels. So what are the practical reasons for popularity of procedural generation? First of all, it comes from a synergy of different factors. First of all, the current production methods very much favor procedural generation. Around 2006, 2007, were a big difference that happened, or a big change that happens to gaming is that independent game development started to be big. Right now there's a huge number of independent games called indies for short, and these games are often produced by just a single person or two people. And using procedural generation enables a very small team to create very complex games with very complex words. So that's current production methods favor procedural generation. But also it's compliant with many popular genres. Since I'm not sure how deep you are into gaming, so I might skip the explanation. But the current popular genres are very well suited to procedural generation. But it also is very compliant with the newest forms of marketing. So the current, one of the most popular current forms of marketing, gaming marketing, is Twitch. Twitch is basically a streaming service where people play games and other people can watch them while they are playing. So you might initially think that it's the most boring thing ever, just to watch someone play a game. But it's more like, it's very similar to how we watch sports without playing sports. It is entertaining. Because, for example, you like the person who is playing, and the person often just comments a lot, so you oftentimes like the stream for the personality of the player. But my point is that it's very easy to promote a game using this type of service when it's a when it's a procedurally generated game, because just as with this example that I've given you already, you can basically stream the game for hundreds of hours. And there will be always something entertaining to show to your audience. And it's also compliant with iterative model of game design. That, again, I won't go into details here. But there are also some philosophical reasons for popularity of PG, or of procedural generation, or rather, philosophical reasons why it is interesting. So let me just give them to you. So, first of all, procedural generation is a promise of a fully autonomous art. It's a strong statement, but the point is that whenever you create art, you have this feeling that you are reusing existing assets. So you are copying something, let's say, from your memory, from your childhood, for books you have read, and so on and so forth. And in case of procedural generation, the act of creation of a world, of a picture, is completely disjointed from outside reality. So it's just happened on a computer and that's it. It's not connected causally to anything outside. So you might say that this is a good example of a fully autonomous art. And it might be said that it's authorship without intention and without reference. So things which are procedurally generated do not refer to the real world, because they were just created, using a philosophical comparison, they are basically swamp mats. They've been created on the spot, and they have no connection to anything outside of it. So they do not refer to anything. You can add this reference looking at it, but it was just generated. And the author did not have the intention to put it there. Of course, the author shapes the procedure, but then the author might be completely surprised by what was created by the procedure. So the author might be like, wow, that's a nice tower. I would never have thought that my procedure would create this tower. So this tower is now something that was not intentionally created by anyone, but it's there and you might enjoy it. So to use as a classic example, if you ask if Winston Churchill's face made by ants is his portrait, you can just as well ask if is a lake generated by a computer lake. So in Minecraft you have a lake, but nobody put it there. You just put the law which says that the lake may be somewhere. So nobody put these trees in Minecraft here, and so on and so forth. There's no person behind it. And procedural generation enables the players to discover new structures. So it's a very nice feeling. When you travel through Minecraft world, you really are a discoverer. You really are seeing things nobody before saw. And at least most probably, because of course it's probable somewhere the same word were generated twice, but it's super improbable. So the point is that you already are discovering a new world. It's a nice feeling. And not just discovering someone else's imagination or someone else's intentions, like in normal games. And it creates gravitas, as the thing player experiences may never happen again. So if something happens in a procedurally generated game, you better record it, because it may never happen to you again, but it also may never happen to anyone in the world again. So it might be a very interesting thing that you want to show people or to talk about with other people. So it creates this feeling, wow, something crazy just happened. And it liberates players from meta-analysis. What I mean by that is that normally in games, especially if they are puzzle games, in puzzle games you kind of feel like you are exploring the mind of the creator of the puzzle. So typically if you go through a game world, and you see a house, you might be like, why is this house here? What does it signify? What should I do with this house? What does it mean? And so on. But if you encounter a house in a procedurally generated game, you're completely free of that. Because, well, why is this house here? Well, this was just generated here. What's the significance of this house? Nothing. There's no significance. It's just a house. So it's a nice feeling of the world without meaning. And it promises design with responsibility. For example, ethical or aesthetical or looking responsibility. So let me just focus on the ethical with the last example. This is a real example of Minecraft in which something close to swastika was generated. But it was procedurally generated. And there was a huge discussion on the forum. Shouldn't it be censored? And someone says, but no one put this swastika there. It was just a stroke of luck. It's actually not a full swastika. It's close enough, right? So the point is that people started to discuss what to do with this, because you might have very unethical things that happen in these virtual worlds, but they are nobody's fault because they just happen. So they create this ethical dilemma. If we should just try to censor them, like anticipate them, and censor certain shapes, and so on. Right? And there we go. So, thanks. We have plenty of time for discussion. Do we have any questions?
You are talking about the 4 types of RRMs.
Yeah.
And the only one which was problematic was the one where you can get the money from the game. But there are a lot of servers where you can sell the rewards to the other players, not to the game itself, but to the other players. So does it make the other 3 types that are not problematic also a problematic one?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. It's so the answer would be that our initial we thought about that, because of course you're absolutely right. This exists, but when we started to think about this, we made a very conscious decision that we are going to focus only on legal usage of loot boxes. So the reason for it is simple. If you create a law, you start by thinking about what are the legal possibilities. Because if you just take into account all the illegal possible uses, then I mean every law is problematic because every law is somehow broken. So I would say in this case, if the law, because these additional servers are not legal, so if the law functioned as it should, this wouldn't be a problem at all. But we would still have the problem with the loot box, with the fourth class of loot boxes. Because so our point was that even if you abstract away from the fact that people may find ways of sneaking the possibility of saying it, there still is a problem with this class. That's why we focus on this. So we wanted to look at the law without looking at the possibilities of breaking it, which are currently possible. Thank you.
Just a point of clarification regarding the procedural generation. So suppose you have a library of some elements like a mountain, a lake, a forest and so on, and you have a program which combines these elements. Sorry. Is this already a procedural generation or no?
It is a form of procedural generation, but this will what we will probably call just a procedural generation of a level, let's say. In some of these games, this is exactly how it works. They have like elements which are combined, but in a game like Minecraft, it doesn't work like that. So in a game like Minecraft is much more fine-grained. So something can be a hill or a mountain, depending on how many basically pixels were generated. And it is classified by you depending on what you think it is. But for a game, it wasn't a category of mountain or a category of. So
moving towards autonomous art means moving away from this simple way of generating.
The more fine-grained, the more autonomous.
Okay, yeah.
So I wanted to ask about the third case of the kinds of structures you were looking at, because you said it didn't count as gambling, and I wonder why. Because I'm paying money for something, and I don't know whether I'm going to get something I want, and I know in fact that it's going to be random. Why isn't that enough to count as a kind of gambling?
Because it has no value. Because its value is always zero.
Value in terms of, I mean, it depends on how we want to value, right?
I mean, I get this point, we talked about it a lot. So our solution was that there's only one value that counts when people talk about gambling, and this value is money. Or basically anything you can exchange for money. So anything that, I didn't want to go into that complicated explanation, but we said that anything you get that has value in a sense that it is basically the part of economy. So it can be part of gold, of course. Yeah. But the point is that there are things which have value in a sense that they are in a relational structure with other valuable things, such as money or gold and stuff. And as long as you are isolated from this structure, you are actually getting something that has no value. And because of that, even if it can have an aesthetical value for you, it's not gambling, it's more like throwing money out of the window or just throwing a lot of money to someone who plays a song because you like it, because you like it. You throw a lot of money, you get some pleasure out of it, but you don't have any value. That's more similar to this case.
I can actually see that. That makes sense. Say someone pays for an online radio service.
Yeah.
They don't know what songs they're going to get.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
We started off with a difference between real randomness generators and fake ones.
Yeah.
But look, in mathematics, of course, you can produce without looking into the real world random generators with pi or whatever, and you say just take the 10th piece of the decimal expansion or whatever. From the point of view of the user, it's just the the same as a real random generation. So the question is, why would you put that emphasis on that difference? Where do you use it?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're using pi to generate numbers, I would say it's a pseudo-random generator and not a real one, because it just.
Because you cannot repeat it, that's clear.
Yeah.
But for the user, it's the same.
Of course, from the epistemological perspective, it's the same.
Yeah.
But it matters for some cases. So it matters, for example, for online casinos. Because if I'm paying money and I want to take part in an online casino, I want to be safe that this is not something that can be hacked. The pseudo-random procedure can be hacked.
Okay.
So if someone knows my procedure and replicates the same circumstances,
That's the only part.
that's the real part.
If I think about this question, actually every random generator is pseudo-random. Because every time you can find an algorithm which can generate the same number, or if I think about like computers, there could be loose wire that can generate number depending on which voltage they're inducted on. You can always find a situation where you can generate the same number. Actually, it depends just on how precise the randomness should be. Or
The trick is that if we believe, that's the assumption here, if we believe that there are random processes in the world, that's the important assumption. Because if you don't believe that there are random processes in the world, there's no true randomness in computers, because there's no true randomness anywhere. But of course, if you believe that there are random processes, just like, for example, the processes of the fluid in this lava lamp, or weather, if you believe that there is randomness there, then what you call true randomness is taking the values from it. So if you believe there is randomness out there, you just take the values out of this random process, and then someone who repeated this procedure wouldn't get the same number. So that's the entire purpose.
Also, if maybe it is theoretically possible to compute how the bubbles in the lava lamp will move in the future, but you would have to know everything about every particle that is in the lamp, and we are not in the situation that we can compute this. Maybe at some point in the future we'll be able to analyze each particle in this lava lamp and then predict how it will move further, and so you will know, so you will find a pattern there. But we are not we don't have enough computational power to count this.
so it's just a matter of time and true randomness becomes randomness.
Again,
We will be able to.
The answer will be, again, if there is not true randomness in the world, you always can get this. If, for example, the behavior of an atom is not computationally predictable, not just because we don't have computational power, but just in principle, then you can take data from it. The computer can somehow measure the behavior of its atom, just like atom clocks measure the frequency of that. Then that's the same answer. If true randomness exists, you can tap into it, and that's how computers will use it and are using it.
Other questions?
Just at the beginning, at the part where we were talking about how brain uses dopamine to like surprises, you had a picture with a mouse in some experimental scenario, and you didn't really talk about it, so I was wondering if there is some interesting experiment.
Of course, it's a classic Skinner's experiment with rats. So basically, the experiment is that you give a rat a button, and when like a standard experiment standard setup at the beginning is that the button, if the rat presses the button, it gets a reward, right? And normally what you get is that the rat associates pressing the button with it. But the interesting part is that what will happen if you start to give rewards to animals such as rats, or in Skinner's example, he also used a lot of pigeons. So let's say that you have pigeons in the boxes and you give them reward completely randomly. So you would think that they will just they will not create any specific type of behavior because it was just random. But what they do instead is that they try to find a pattern and try to repeat this pattern as long as you can. So after a few, let's say after a day when you just give these random rewards to the pigeons and you enter the room, you will see one pigeon who is just going like that, the other who just takes his wing all the time like that, the other who just pecks a given place in the, because as it happened, 1 or 2 times they did this and they got the reward. So they think that this is a pattern and they started to repeat it a lot. And this is what happens if any of you who has a dog, some dogs, my dog for example, whenever I'm going to give her food, she just goes into circles like this weird way. And why? Because I mean she did it a few times in her life and she thinks that there's a very interesting causal connection. But there is no, of course. So this is basically what happened to her. And I mean this happens to people as well. So that's the reason I use this picture.
I have a very mean comment about the pigeons. It sounds like the history of religion.
Yeah, I mean this is the connection is absolutely there. So this is
we observed some some things from weather, for example, and you try to find a pattern, and you are not able to find a pattern, so you say that the gods.
So my friend who studies religion from a cognitive science point of view just blatantly makes this connection. This is basically religion is a very organized form of this phenomenon.
Pigeons should probably be some
Yes. I totally protest because this is a misunderstanding of the meta level of religious thought, which is not that object level as Freud and other people describe it. So,
I'm not, this is not my
it's a
official
misunderstanding of what religion is.
It's not my official opinion, it's just something what I at some point we can see, at some level we can see.
Well, I was disappointed to see that the Pole and the Slovak were dumping on religion. But I'm glad that the German kicked in. I mean, I know we're in the Czech Republic. But the Pole especially.
I also more serious comment about the third category of randomness. You said that it's quite new phenomenon, but I see some connection to what happened what happens in Czech Republic and Slovakia. There are people who sell, let's say, kitchen equipment or jewelry, and they find a group of old people. They put them into one place, and they give 2 hours or 3 hours of talks how this equipment is good.
We have them.
Okay, so this is something. In the context of this room, this is something that has some specific value, but it's not of that much value as you actually pay. So you pay money and you get something which has value in this context, but once you are with your family, they tell you that the kitchen equipment is just rubbish.
But the difference here is that I would say that there's a big difference because it's just cheating, because this is what you get is not something this has no value, and more importantly in these games, it does not have value, and it's also advertised as not having value. So it's not like people getting these objects and they think, I will sell them, and then they are shocked to learn that they can't sell them. From the beginning it's said, you can't sell them, there's always be tied to your account. So that's a big difference. So, and the second big difference is that I'm not sure about this scheme, and the specifics of this scheme, although I have one story to tell about it, it would be good for later. But I'm not sure if they are using any randomness there. Like if there is any lottery or something. Might be.
That's true.
I think there's a question.
few examples for the uses of these random producers or these random procedures were rather to introduce different continuations of the games. But one can use it also for how the player reacts on the different randomness cases. For example, all the games where we use randomness, like dice, it's the probability knowledge to cope with it, which is part of the game. But in your case, this was not part of the game, at least as I saw it. Because a clever player, of course, uses the probabilistic stories like game theory and so on.
Yeah, so, thanks. So we didn't talk about it, but this phenomenon exists. So, for most players who use these games just as entertainment products, they don't go into greed. They just actually, they have pleasure with randomness, and that's it. They just want to have a surprise.
Exactly.
But there are players who create huge spreadsheets which analyze the probability, try to find this. So there is something we call in game studies theory crafting, which you would be surprised how close it is to academic work actually. Some of the players go really, really far into creating theories of how games work. So to just point out one thing that was actually discovered by these players, and this is something I didn't talk about because of time constraints, but it's very interesting, I think, is that these players discovered that in some games it is very, very highly probable, and at least in one game it was actually proven, it is very highly probable that developers actually added special, something called PT algorithms. So whenever a player gets bad rewards, there is an algorithm which tells if the player gets bad rewards, give him something good, because the player might be uninterested and frustrated and will stop playing the game. And this is, on paper, it looks like a nice thing to do. It's just like, oh, just give him something. But in reality, it actually taps into gambler's fallacy as hell. Because in games, it's actually true that if you are unlucky, you will be lucky. So that's very risky.
It's gambler's wisdom.
Yeah, here is gambler's wisdom. And it was discovered by these people who try to on a method. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, I'm still thinking, you said about this problematic third case of the third category, and you said that you need more empirical data, more thinkable, so I completely respect that. It just, like, intuitively, my first reaction is this mechanism, even though it doesn't have the monetary reward on the other side, it still feeds on this gambler's fallacy and other biases to force you to spend more money. And it seems to me like this is the important part, right? So it actually seems that it's even worse than the fourth case because you can't even get anything better in the case.
But the trick is that for some people, what is key is that this mechanism does not give you a huge boost that you get from games in which you can really win money. So to give you an example, so it might be not as problematic in the sense of, for example, addiction as is gambler's addiction. So to give you an example, in PUBG, you can actually buy something for $5, and then you can win something you can sell for $400 legally. So this kind of experience gives you a completely different boost, because you just feel like, wow, if it happens again, then just maybe I will pay my rent. So that's a huge difference for some people, because it might be tapping into addictiveness aspect more. But I agree that they do prey on the same fallacies, yes.
And also a question about the broader context in Belgium, so they banned the loot boxes, like completely banned. And do they allow internet casinos, let's say, or any kind of gambling?
It's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to this.
Because
But if they do, they probably. The point is that if they do, this is probably regulated differently, because the point here was to. I mean, if they have casinos, again, I don't really know. I didn't check this. So if they have casinos, they probably just like in any country, other countries, the casinos are not allowed for minors. You have to have 18 years.
yeah.
So in these games, they banned loot boxes because they are products used by minors. So the other option might be to just sell these games only for 18 years or older, I guess. But it's also possible that they actually have no casinos at all. So there are big differences between different countries. So for example, Denmark and Czech Republic are similar in the sense that we have much more relaxed laws than Poland, because we, for example, don't have that many casinos just like openly like you have, for example, in this space. Right, just walking here, I saw the casino. Oh, that's interesting. That's a view that I wouldn't see in Poland, but I would see it in Denmark. So different countries have different regulations.
Yeah, because I thought usually if you want to have a casino somewhere, then you have to have some, I don't know, someone has to allow that.
Yeah, you have to have a permit,
Yeah.
and also kids are not allowed and stuff like that. So that's a problem. That for the publishers, it's a decision. Either we are treating your games like gambling, and then you have to have a permit, and you have to sell it for 18 euros. But this is business, from the business perspective, is very bad for them.
Yeah.
So
I was just thinking why they banned it, if they would give
probably
because
that's the reason, but I would have to look into their laws, which I actually not aware of.
Okay. Do we have any questions? If there are no questions, we can finish a bit earlier, so thank you once more.